So thank you very much, Louisa, for a kind introduction. It's a great honor for me to be here today. I bring you greetings from the other side of the pond. This is my first visit to Leiden, though Leiden has always been an icon in my imagination since, as you probably know, some pilgrims who were fearful of the British escaped to Leiden and actually sheltered in this church before getting on a boat in which they landed in Massachusetts, in Plymouth, in 1620, and 10 years later they removed themselves from the harsh winters to a place about 2 blocks from my office, which was called Newtown in Cambridge. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I can say certainly it's a lot easier to fly this way today than it was to get on a rather rickety boat about 400 years ago to try to make it across the ocean. The topic I was assigned was fear and decision-making in government. And in particular, as Louisa said, I'll take us back to where we started yesterday with Professor Herman Philipse, where he was trying to think about systemic risk and the fear that that perhaps should engender, but often doesn't because it's not so immediate for us. He was talking about the case of climate change. I'm going to talk about the case of nuclear danger. And as a window into this issue, I want us to think back 51 years next month to the most frightening experience in recorded history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So October 1962, and let me get you to try to imagine that you were there, perhaps as an assistant working in the White House for President Kennedy. It's October 16, 1962, and briefers come in, the National Security Advisor, to tell the President that the U.S. intelligence community has discovered the Soviet Union attempting to sneak nuclear-tipped strategic offensive missiles onto the island of Cuba. The first reaction was, what in the world can be going on? The second reaction is, this cannot stand. And the next question was, what to do? So think about it for yourself, what to do, and how to decide what to do. So this was an extraordinary case in which initially the thought was, well, of course, this is unacceptable. It can be prevented by simply attacking these missiles while they're under construction before they become operational. And that was the consensus view of the president and his brother and the others involved for the first 2 or 3 days. But actually, in terms of how to decide what to do, the president decided maybe to stop and think and to deliberate and to have a chance to reflect about what the likely consequences would be. So at the time, in the midst of the crisis, 2 or 3 days in, he and his brother were caught on a moment talking to each other, and they're saying, how is this going to end? And the president says to Bobby Kennedy, his brother, I think there's about a 1 in 3 chance to even that this ends in war, even nuclear war. And had that been the outcome, 100 million people would have been killed rather quickly. We would be unlikely to be exploring fear and the issues here today. Flash forward, how did they decide? Well, they looked at the options. They chose a naval blockade. The blockade was to prevent future shipments of nuclear weapons and missiles to Cuba. But it had the disadvantage, as it was pointed out by Dean Acheson, among others at the table, that this didn't do anything to what was already in the island. And obviously, during the meantime, the Soviets rushed the missiles to completion. So over the course of a week, it became clear that the blockade was doing a pretty good job of stopping additional things coming into Cuba, but was not preventing anything happening on the ground in Cuba. So In that sense, the blockade had provided time, but had failed. So flash to the end of the missile crisis, October 27, the darkest, blackest day of the crisis. Again, imagine you were there. You come to the meeting, or maybe you're sitting on the back row. There's 13 or 16 people sitting around the table. And the question is what to do. What to do. There are two options and only two options on the table. Attack the missiles to prevent their becoming operational, or acquiesce in the fact that there are now missiles in Cuba, and that's a fait accompli. As you're having the meeting, you discover that actually, in the first instance, a US U-2 flying over Cuba, trying to tell what's happening on the island, is shot down. So an American has died. There's standing orders to retaliate against the SAM sites that attack the missiles. But people begin to worry, well, gee, but if we respond against them, then what leads one thing to the other? So that's postponed for a little bit. Secondly, somebody wanders into the meeting and says, Mr. President, bad news. Another US U-2, which was on an air sampling mission over the Arctic, has by accident flown into the Soviet territory and may appear to them to be taking last look before targeting an attack. If you want to read some chilling language, Khrushchev's account of that after the crisis is really beautiful. I mean, it's almost poetry. And again, Kennedy says, well, I guess there's always some son of a bitch that didn't get the word. Okay? Trying to sort of gallows humor, thinking, what in the world is this going to do for us? In any case, at this last minute, on the final Saturday, Kennedy invents an option that's not even in the box, way outside the box. And we may come back to that towards the end. So take these as two data points or a window for looking at the issue of immediate nuclear danger. Now, what do we know about human beings from Biology 101? You already did some of this yesterday, or physiology or psychology. So in nature, deer senses the wolf. Let's imagine a Kosovar senses Milosevic, if you go back to yesterday. And there's two options, fight or flight. Imagine you're in Syria today. You've got two options. About 6 million people have taken flight. So there's 6 million people that have been displaced from their houses, just not very far from here in Syria. And there are other people who are fighting. So historically, what do we know about the jungle or the ocean? The big fish eat the little fish. Actually, a famous Dutch painting expressed this even better in the 16th century. And as you notice, as Hobbes wrote about this, this is the war of all against all. So little fish get away, or alternatively, they're eaten. That's it. Human beings imagine ourselves as Homo sapiens, we call ourselves. We flatter ourselves, perhaps. But in any case, we imagine that there's some other alternative to flying or fighting. And that's called negotiating. And in the missile crisis, actually, we have almost a textbook example of lessons in decision-making, especially crisis management, in a case in which danger engenders fright, quite realistically, that could lead to fight. Flight is not too much available if you're a superpower sitting in the US or the Soviet Union at the time. But there is an alternative, negotiate or try to find some third way out. So what about this textbook case of decision making? Let me underline very quickly 7 checkpoints or checklists for effective, thoughtful decision making in the case of fear as an alternative to, or at least when thinking about, my only alternatives are flight and fight. So first, time. Taking time to decide. As President Kennedy said at the time, and actually looking at it as a student of the crisis, if they had had to choose in the first 48 hours, no question they would have chosen an airstrike. That was the preference of the president. That was the preference, actually, there was nobody at the table who disagreed with that. Nobody. But because they took 6 days in time, in privacy, in secrecy, to think about this, they had a chance to think about what the consequences would be, and then even to change their mind, and then to change their mind again. So time, okay? Secondly, multiple minds. The president clearly was the decision maker, no question about that, but he also understood he had no monopoly of insight, no monopoly of wisdom. Not surprisingly, different eyes, different minds see different angles, can see different complexities. So the idea of the engagement of people who have respect for each other, but whose minds don't necessarily meld, but who interact, produces a clearer picture. Third, a deliberative process, a constructive deliberative process in which, without fear of embarrassment or punishment, people can disagree and can argue with each other and can engage each other, can even have unconventional thoughts, even thoughts they would be embarrassed about afterwards as they're exploring a possibility. So a constructive and deliberative process. Fourth, rigorous analysis of the issue, the dynamics of the issue, the options, and their consequences. In the missile crisis, the first round of analysis was wrong, the second round of analysis was wrong, the third round of analysis was wrong. Even after the fact, you can see there were many mistakes in what was done because there were remaining things that were unknown. But views that were held in the first day and the second day and the third day were clarified by further evidence, by further analysis. So rigorous analysis can't be underestimated. Fourth is a vivid awareness of the necessity for, but also the limits of control of the huge organizations, of which in this instance the president was nominally the commander-in-chief. So once governments begin to engage, thousands of people, not thousands, hundreds of thousands of people start doing things themselves. And these are the Navy on the blockade line, which is or is not following orders, usually is, but in its own way. And so if you go back to the story of the missile crisis, Kennedy says there'll be no firing, but there's this famous scene in which the Navy is actually firing star shells, which are not attack weapons, but are in effect almost like fireworks, but as a form of signaling, which might be misinterpreted. Or even more dramatically, the anti-submarine force are dropping depth charges to try to cause submarines to rise to the surface, but which might seem to a commander in a submarine that he was under attack, since in effect he is. That is, the submarine becomes rather unstable with the effort to cause him to surface. And a submarine commander almost decided to launch nuclear weapons against the US because he thought he was under attack. That's one of the facts that's come out in the postmortems on this afterwards. So a very vivid sense that even though I'm the commander-in-chief, a whole lot of stuff is happening that I don't have fine control over, that I'm not orchestrating. Sixth, an empathy for the adversary, empathy at least enough to be able to see things through his eyes, understand what may be concerning him, and providing for him a way out. And seventh and finally, creative imagination in constructing options for getting out of the box, for getting a solution that's good enough for my interests, but that prevents an outcome that could be catastrophic. In the missile crisis on the 27th, given these two options of attack or acquiesce, and everybody else at the table, or most of the people, thinking that's it and we should attack, because nobody was in favor, well, maybe one person was in favor of acquiescing, Kennedy invented a very strange concoction that consisted of three elements: a public offer that if the Soviets would withdraw the missiles from Cuba, the US would guarantee that it would not invade Cuba to overturn it. Secondly, a private ultimatum delivered by his brother to the Soviet ambassador that said, if we don't hear within 24 hours that the missiles are being withdrawn, we will eliminate the missiles. So an ultimatum. And third and finally, a secret sweetener that said we will not deal for the US missiles in Turkey, which were regarded as analogous by the Soviets. But if this missile crisis in Cuba is resolved, within 6 months, there will not be missiles in in Turkey. So no deal, quote, but if this happens, that will happen. And that third element was kept secret for quite a long time. Okay, so first point, a model textbook case of a checklist for decision-making about how to react to maximum fear in a concrete crisis. Okay? So, secondly, stretching just 2 points beyond that and trying to connect to the systemic point yesterday. Secondly, after the crisis management, Kennedy and in fact Khrushchev decided crisis management is too hard. If we run this experiment over again and again, it's going to end catastrophically. Go back to the estimate of the risks of war. So risks of war between 1 and 3 and even. Is that a reasonable estimate? As a historian of the crisis, I would say absolutely. Indeed, it was even more dangerous than Kennedy and his associates understood. They thought the only problem of nuclear weapons were the strategic nuclear weapons being installed in Cuba. After the fact, at one of the postmortems that we ran actually in Havana with Castro among others, we discovered there were 162 tactical nuclear weapons that the US government was unaware of already on the island. So if there'd been an attack followed by an invasion, tactical nuclear weapons that the US was unaware of would have been used against the US. So even more dangerous than they were estimating. But in any case, imagine it's 1 in 3. That means that in a revolver that's got 5 shells, there's 2 or 3 bullets that are live, and you fire the gun and you say, how did this work out? And you survive. You say, well, this is not so hard. The answer to that is no, that's not a good idea. Okay, not a good idea. So both Kennedy and Khrushchev decided crisis management is too hard among nuclear powers and moved to something called crisis prevention. So preventing having events like the Cuban Missile Crisis that were too hard to manage. And in particular, after the crisis, they installed a hotline, direct communication between US and Russia. That didn't exist in 1962. It took actually 12 hours to get a message back and forth. I mean, imagine that. Okay? And they began a process of arms control to try to limit the risks of accidental war or misinterpretation or miscommunication. But in particular, they began evolving what Kennedy afterwards called the precarious rules of the status quo. Precarious rules of the status quo that constrained the competition so that never thereafter did one party interfere in a dramatic way the vital interests of the other. So that's crisis prevention. Finally, systemic risk. To go back to the point yesterday, what about changing the whole system to create a world in which things like this don't happen? After the crisis, Kennedy became haunted by his nightmare that on the current trend line, by the end of the 1970s, there would be 25 nuclear weapon states. And then there would be crises among multiple nuclear weapon states. And the consequences of that would surely be nuclear wars. And so he and others began a process that began with the Limited Test Ban Treaty, and then the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and then arms control, and then ultimately the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 that actually bent the curve of history. If you look at the trend line, it was going like this, and there would have been 25 nuclear weapon states by the end of the 70s if states acquired weapons at the same time they acquired the capability to have weapons. But instead, because of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there are only 9 nuclear weapon states today. So this is a bending of a trend line. So creating systemically a world in which the crises don't happen that would create the fear, that would create the risk, that would present such a likelihood of catastrophe, I think is a challenge not just in nuclear danger today, and you'll see that actually here in the Netherlands just in a few months when the Nuclear Security Summit is hosted by The Hague next April, but also in the climate area. So if we can conclude here, this is President Kennedy's lessons.
Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war.
Okay, so if you were drawing a single lesson from the crisis, I think Kennedy's lesson is the telling one, that in a world of such dangers, powers must avoid confrontations that leave their adversary with the choice between a catastrophic outcome for me and a humiliation that they would be unwilling to accept. So if you want more on the Cuban Missile Crisis, last year for the 50th anniversary at Harvard, we put up a website. You can just go to cubanmissilecrisis.org, and it's got the recent information about it, analyses, pro and con, debate, the relevant videos. And if that's not enough, with a colleague, I've launched this year a MOOC at Harvard, a course that is a version of the course that I've been teaching at Harvard for about 30 years. You can sign up at HarvardX or edX, which is the co-venture with MIT, as an auditor. It's about a 6-week version of the 14-week course that I teach, or actually until Monday, the competition is still open for being in the Harvard Online Classroom, of which there are 500 spaces. So I'm 3 minutes over, but I'm open for questions.